Welcome. I want to share with you a quote from, you may recognize this gentleman, Albert Einstein. And at one point he said, "I never teach my pupils. I only attempt to provide the conditions in which they can learn." Now the first thought you might have is, how can someone be a teacher if they do not teach? Well, that's not exactly what he meant. Hopefully your next thought would be, well, if he's a great teacher, then how can I provide the conditions in which my students can learn? And that's really what we're going to be talking about in this video, as well as essentially all the videos in this training. So I want to introduce you to a concept called student-centered learning. Sometimes it's also called learner-centered learning. We're going to use this term primarily, student-centered learning, as opposed to, or in contrast to, teacher-centered learning. Teacher-centered learning is something that we are all extremely familiar with. It's certainly the way I was taught in college, very likely the way you were taught, and very likely the way you are currently teaching. I started out, think lecture here. So doing exactly what I'm doing to you right now. I am talking at you, hopefully you're sitting wherever you are, jotting down a few notes, very passively. So the only thing going on in that learning environment is me talking, you taking notes. Student-centered learning, on the other hand, there's a lot of activity going on in the room. The students are actively engaged in the learning process, and we're going to start exploring what this thing is. I find it helpful to think of this as a continuum from very teacher-centered learning, strictly lecture, all the way over here where perhaps there's no lecture at all. Maybe there's just constant activity, constant things going on in the classroom. What are those kinds of things? Again, those are things we want to explore in these videos. Now, as we move along this spectrum, and this is really our goal, is to get you to move along this spectrum, several things we need to keep in mind. One is that our role as the instructor changes. In the case of the teacher-centered learning, we are the purveyor of knowledge, we're the sage on the stage, we are the authority. All knowledge runs through us. On the other hand, student-centered learning, our role changes to one more of a facilitator of learning. We're helping the students in their learning process. We're partnering with the students in the learning process. And that's a very significant shift in how we think about our role in the classroom and what we're doing with our students. The other point here is that we can think in terms of a learning environment. So the learning environment here, again, is, in the case of lecture, very passive. We'll share some thoughts on that with you here in just a moment. Obviously, the learning environment is going to be very different as we move towards the student-centered end of this spectrum. What we want you to do, wherever you are on the spectrum currently, is find ways to move in this direction. And if we can get some of you to move along in this way, whether it's from here to here or here to here, whatever the case may be, we will have been successful. Okay. Classic classroom. Typical classic classroom. Instructor, students are sitting in nice little neat rows. Knowledge comes through the instructor and is then transmitted and shared with the students. Very, very passive. In this environment, learning environment, the only sound you hear is the voice of the instructor, just like that's what you're hearing from me. Again, students may be sitting there hopefully listening and perhaps taking some notes, but that's pretty much all that's happening. So this is a conceptual way of thinking about teacher-centered learning, a typical classroom. On the other hand, not a particularly typical classroom, the instructor, what's central here is the knowledge, not the instructor. And notice these are all double arrows here, two-way arrows. So students are interacting with the knowledge, they're learning about the knowledge. We could actually add arrows all along the line here because the instructor and the students are all talking to each other. They're all interacting in that learning process. Activity, lots of activity. So if you walk into this kind of a classroom, what you'll hear is a lot of noise because people are talking, people are working, and they're collaborating, they're talking with each other, and they're engaged in that learning process. So this is just one way of thinking about this student-centered learning environment. Okay, so let's compare and contrast these. So the teacher-centered learning, Student participation, again, is very passive. Instructor is the leader and the authority. Assessment of learning, so how do we assess whether they've learned or not? That's pretty much only summative. So I put these definitions down here. Summative is to evaluate student learning, so it comes at the end of the learning process. Think exam or test. We're going to get to formative learning here in a moment. Again, for teacher-centered learning, it's pretty much only summative. Student prior knowledge is not at all taken into account because the only knowledge that's coming through the instructor. Learning environment is individualistic and competitive. So every student is taking their notes, they're trying to get their best grade on their exam, etc. Student contributions to the learning process, that's just not happening, it's not there. Let's contrast that then with student-centered learning. Again, student participation is very, very active. They're doing things. Instructor, again, this idea of a facilitator or partner in the learning process with the students. Assessment of learning, now we start to get into formative and summative. So there are still tests and exams, but we start getting into this formative assessment, which is the monitoring student learning. It's happening during the learning process. Summative is happening at the end of the learning process. Formative is happening during the learning process. Student prior knowledge is taken into account because the students are contributing to that base of knowledge. If there are errors then the instructor can figure that out and try to make sure that those errors go away. Learning environment is very collaborative. Students are working together, very supportive. And again, positive contributions. The students are actually engaged in and contributing to the learning process in that classroom. So again, our goal is to get you to move along the spectrum. Now, when that happens, one of the things that you need to do is to recognize that that's going to require a shift in your mindset about teaching, about learning, about your students, about yourself as teachers. A shift in mindset, and you have to be open-minded in order to start this process of moving down the spectrum. So as we go back to this, we start to recognize that what Albert Einstein was talking about was exactly that, is establishing a student learning environment in which students can learn separate from or distinguished from strictly I'm teaching, meaning I'm simply lecturing and giving knowledge to my students. Now, I have an assignment for you. An assignment is this, very quickly. On a piece of paper, take a piece of paper. What I'd like you to do is to sketch out what a typical classroom looks like, one of your classrooms. What does your typical classroom physically look like? What's the interaction going on there? On one side of the piece of paper, on the other side of the piece of paper, you can now sketch out your vision, or how you envision, what you envision a student-centered classroom would look like. Included in both those cases, what's happening in the room? What are the students actually doing? Again, in the case of typical classroom, they're just sitting there. Here, maybe they're having discussions, maybe they're working on assignments, et cetera, et cetera. Make a list of how the student-centered classroom differs. Your vision of the student-centered classroom differs from your current classroom. Also, make a list of the ideas that how you might turn your typical classroom into something that would accommodate a student-centered learning environment. So not just what it might look like, but how would you get there? What changes would you make or would you be able to make to shift from this type of classroom to the student-centered learning environment? And then once you're done that, certainly keep those sketches and lists for later on in the workshop, because you will get, we will kind of come back to that and you'll get even better ideas as we go along. So again, sketch out typical classroom that you have right now, what you would envision a student-centered classroom would look like, and then make a list of how it differs, how those two differ. Make a list of the ideas that you have that you might, how you can actually make this happen, potentially happen, and then keep that for later. Thank you.